Warm welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining this webinar on portable digital identity as an enabler of international remittances. I will briefly share with you some logistical notes before we start. So the webinar is going to last around 1 hour and 30 minutes. It is being recorded, and we will share the recording with you in the days after the webinar alongside the slide deck. In case you have any questions on the presentation or during the panel discussion, please add them in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen and specify to whom your question is addressed, and we'll respond to them at the end of the webinar. Let me now introduce to you my dear colleague, Mamadou Diallo, who is our Senior Financial Sector Specialist. Over to you, Mamadou.
Thank you very much, Justin. I would like to start by thanking our partner consultant in this research, Accenture, for their professionalism, expertise, and very good collaboration throughout the research. I would also like to thank the whole UNCDF project team that managed this research. Allow me to start to acknowledge that digital ID is not a new topic per se, and digital ID implementation within countries is already discussed in several forums. But the purpose of this webinar and our research is not to discuss digital identity overall, but rather its use case across borders, its interlinkage with migration, financial and socioeconomic inclusion of migrants, and international remittances. My name is Mamadou Diallo. I'm a Senior Financial Sector Specialist, Migration and Remittances at UNCDF. And I'm very honored to moderate this distinguished panel composed of, from left to right, Mrs. Johnny Brennan. Mrs. Johnny is the president of the Digital Identity and Authentication Council of Canada, DIAC, building on 50+ years of experience in identity access management innovation, adoption, and industry standards development. Johnny helps the DIAC to fulfill its vision, delivering the resources needed to establish a digital identity ecosystem in Canada. Johnny has participated in influential committees from organizations including SCC Data Governance Initiative, OECD, ISO, and ITU. Thank you, Johnny, for joining us. The second panel member is Mr. Samatar Omar Elmi. Mr. Samatar is Chief ICT Specialist at the African Development Bank. In this regard, he manages a diversified portfolio of digital projects across the continent. He has led dozens of policy, strategic, regulatory, analytical works, and numerous feasibility studies, which have resulted in investment operations in 12 countries throughout Africa. Welcome, Mr. Samatar. The third panel member is Mr. Kevin Moll. Mr. Kevin is the head of Global Digital Assets for Western Union and its affiliates. In this role, Kevin leads Western Union's digital asset business, including strategy, product, and partnership development, go-to-market strategy, and additional areas as they relate to cryptocurrency and blockchain. Prior to joining Western Union, Kevin was a vice president at Ripple, and prior to that, Kevin was advising financial service providers at McKinsey and the Boston Consulting Group. Thank you for joining, Kevin. The fourth panelist is Mrs. Bridget Carroll. Bridget is Policy Lead Americas at Wise, a digital money transfer operator. Based in Washington, Bridget joined Wise policy team in Brussels in 2019, focused on EU policy. Prior to joining Wise, Bridget was working in public affairs and advocacy in Brussels at global communications firm Fleishman Hillard and the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU. Thank you for joining us, Bridget. And last but not least, Mrs. Louise James. Mrs. Louise is Managing Director at Accenture, where she is the global lead for Accenture Development Partnerships. Accenture Development Partnerships is a not-for-profit unit within Accenture that leverages Accenture's capabilities to address global development and humanitarian needs, working with the world's leading companies, multilaterals and bilateral donors, international NGOs, and private foundations. Luis engages with ADP's clients to develop new inclusive business models and strengthen the capabilities of the nonprofit sector to help solve global development challenges. Thank you for joining us, Luis. Before we go to the panel discussion, I'm going to present briefly the high-level insights of the research that we just conducted. Then we'll have the panel members respond to questions from the moderator before panel members respond to questions from participants. The presentation on the research insights will be very brief to leave ample time for the panel discussion. Note that the full research report will be published very soon. During this presentation, I'll be covering the landscape of cross-border digital identity initiatives, the key high-level challenges in accepting digital identity across borders, and recommendations and call to action. To start, I think it's important that we're aligned with the broader concepts at play here. There exist two types of identification overall. Foundational ID systems that provide legal identity, such as national ID cards in many countries, and on the other hand, functional identity systems that identify individuals for specific purposes, such as driving, tax, financial services. A digital identity can be of both types of IDs, either as a legal identity or serving a specific purpose, but it simply enables the storage and authentication of individual attributes in the digital sphere. Then next to that, a portable digital identity across borders enables users to reuse their domestic digital identity across borders to prove their identity. To give you a simple example of what we want to achieve, imagine a person from India holding his well-known Aadhaar digital identity and using that Aadhaar in the United States to access financial services and socioeconomic services. Now, you may wonder why we initiated this research. To put it simply, we are looking for possibilities to facilitate access to and increase the usage of digital international remittances. But why is that? Because remittances will continue to be very significant to the economic development of many countries in the world, exceeding 15% of GDP in 25 countries. However, what we notice is that the average cost of formal remittances is still double the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals target of 3%. And we know that a large chunk of the remittance flows are sent using informal channels. Research has shown that out of the many root causes of informal remittance flows is the lack of identity, with as many as 10% of the world population, or 850 million people, lacking any form of official identification. Digital identity, especially when accepted across borders, has the potential to improve economic and regional integration, with research showing that digital ID has the potential to unlock between 3 to 13% additional GDP. And specifically for remittances, digital ID has the potential to drastically increase the flow of formal remittances by increasing the availability of official identification, and also the end-to-end digitization of international remittances, which is expected to reduce the costs. Undertaking this breakthrough research required a structured approach. First, it was important to structure the link between access to digital ID and financial inclusion of migrants. Enabling migrants to use their digital identity across borders provides them an entry point into the financial services ecosystem, including access to formal remittances and to a broader suite of financial products, thus improving migrants' financial inclusion and resilience. Secondly, we used a mixed method research comprising of extensive desk research, interviews with industry experts, and review of case studies to assess not only global, regional, but also national context and the needs and challenges of diverse group of stakeholders, including migrants, governments and regulators, financial service providers, and non-governmental organizations. Lastly, to provide globally representative insights, we assessed implementations and challenges in developed economies, as well as in emerging and least developed economies. And for example, the 4 countries we selected for use cases are Germany, a developed country, Colombia, an emerging country, Kenya, a low-income country, and Bangladesh, a least developed country. There are many benefits associated to digital ID across borders. I won't go through all the slide, but for migrants, the key benefit is that digital identity allows migrants to access to services provided online and across borders, resolving possible communication, travel, and logistical barriers that some migrant might face when moving to another country. For financial service providers, digital identity enables greater cost efficiencies and faster transfers while improving trust and financial crime risk management. And for governments and policymakers, digital identity systems can strengthen security measures by providing a secure and reliable way to authenticate individuals, but also improve the access to basic government services. For NGOs and development sectors, digital identity enables excluded and underserved populations to get access to a form of foundational identification, which enable NGOs and humanitarian organizations to better provide support and services to those who really need them. Now we come to the slide that shows the global landscape of cross-border digital identity initiatives. I won't go into the details. Details will be provided in the report, but note that when we look at the global perspective, the majority of digital identity cross-border initiatives are at exploration and development stages and are more focused between countries who share borders or are within the same regional bloc. This is largely attributable to the major challenge of lacking a standardized approach to adopting digital identity for cross-border use. We'll come back to that within the challenges section. Digital identity technology globally exists and is used at the national level, but what needs to be addressed now are the political, social, cultural challenges. In North and South America, the US and Canada are making progress in terms of digital identity, although the level of adoption of digital identity varies across states or provinces. There is no standardized approach towards digital identity across the North America region. However, Canada is progressing into established trust frameworks at a national level and engaging in some cross-border initiatives with other countries. In Latin America, Mercosur countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay have implemented digital identity programs and has implemented mutually recognized digital identity programs. Colombia, for example, has developed a digital passport that can be used to travel to a number of countries in Latin America. Europe is observed to be more mature compared to the other regions with its European Digital Wallet initiative. The use of national digital identity across sectors is common in several European countries such as Belgium, Estonia, France, Germany, and the Nordics. Next to the EU initiatives, there are also some bilateral initiatives between EU countries. For instance, Germany and Spain have an agreement to develop joint cross-border pilot program for digital ID. In Africa, the digital transformation strategy published by the African Union stressed specifically the significance of legal digitized ID mechanisms for the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. There are a number of regional digital ID initiatives, such as Smart Africa, the World Bank WURI program, etc. In West Africa specifically, we can cite also some functional digital ID systems specific for financial services, such as the bank ID system in the West African Monetary Zone, or the planned central bank-led digital ID by the Central Bank of West African State in the Waimu area. In Asia, of course, everyone knows about the Aadhaar system in India with its popular 1.3 billion users. But there are also other mature systems, such as in Singapore and Indonesia. In terms of the wider Asia, the Asian Digital Integration Framework was also established in 2019 to set priorities for member states to accelerate their digital integration, which includes enabling seamless digital payments by building on existing national digital identity systems. Singapore, to name that country, has been among the leading countries actively involved in cross-border collaborations and has entered into some agreements on mutual recognition of digital identity systems with Australia, the UK, and the EU. I'll stop here about the landscaping. You'll have more details in the report. Looking at the challenges, I'll just summarize again here, leaving the discussion within the panel. But on the digital data and identity management side, what we notice is that there are several different regulations at national levels that exist in relation to data privacy, storage, sharing, more broadly for data governance. And these regulations do not always correlate over different jurisdictions. On the second level of financial services onboarding, again, each country or region has its own unique set of rules and protocols for consumer identification, making it challenging for multinational companies to establish a uniform and efficient system across borders. On the third level, for the migrant population's access, there, what we notice is that migrants, especially refugees, may have no form of foundational identity and may have challenges obtaining new identifications. So for these people, the prospect of having digital identity is not straightforward, coupled with also a lack of strong digital literacy. And last, the fourth level on accessing remittances, the lack of digital identity is a strong enabler for informal remittance flows. I move to the recommendations. The recommendations are structured per type of stakeholders, but we'll start with the recommendations that are valid for all stakeholders. The first recommendation is related to all stakeholders working along and contributing to agreeing to a trust framework or sort of ISO standard for digital identity within a financial services context that meets customer needs. Second, increase engagement in international standardization efforts. Of particular importance, all stakeholders should work towards creating opportunities for safe sandbox environments so that stakeholders, including financial service providers, can test and pilot innovations across borders. For governments, they should lead efforts to convene diverse stakeholder audiences to discuss potentially viable models and create international agreements, especially across major migration corridors. And financial service providers should revise their risk management frameworks to align to the digital landscape. And for the non-governmental organizations, they should lead and convene cross-sector audiences across the borders to promote collaboration and mutually beneficial solutions and discuss best practices from other contexts and use cases. Now to finish the presentation with the call to action, from the research and the analysis, what we see is that the topic of digital ID across borders cannot be solved by individual stakeholders. Governments, regulators, non-governmental organizations, financial service providers should all look to cooperate and coordinate their efforts towards a common goal and purpose. Governments should specifically continue developing their national digital identity infrastructures and increase the adoption, because that is a sort of a prerequisite for implementing digital identity across borders. For financial service providers, they should define and assess clearly the current challenges as they face with the use of digital identity within their operations. And non-governmental organizations should develop, educate, assist developing countries in digital literacy and in building their infrastructure. And regulators across the world should work with the financial services sector to identify the areas which require change. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. I hope that the presentation provided high-level view of the research we conducted. Of course, it is a bit challenging to present it in such a short time frame, but I'm pretty sure that the panel will elaborate into this discussion. So I will start the panel discussion with a first question with Accenture. First question is for Louise, our partner in this research. Louise, we've seen from the report insights that there is no globally accepted digital identity standard or setup or data protection mechanism. At the same time, when we look at the pre-digital era, the passport, we see that the passport is now globally accepted and recognized, with mostly its data being machine readable almost everywhere. According to you, what is hindering progress on acceptable digital ID across borders that can facilitate access to formal financial services for migrants and broadly people on the move?
Great. Well, firstly, thank you, Mamadou. I think you did a fantastic job of presenting a huge amount of content in a concise way. And thank you for the partnership with UNCDF and so many of you on the call who've contributed to the research. As you've said, this is such an important topic. So I'm delighted that we have this chance to delve deeper into it and to talk about it a bit further. So to your question, I think we see a key difference between the progress that what we have around physical passports with the machine readable information versus a digital only passport. And if we think about it in three ways around the who, the how, and the what. So firstly, who manages the data, how that is managed in a digital world, and thirdly, what controls are in place for a digital version to be really considered a reliable and trusted source, and that trust element and that confidence being so important across countries. Obviously, passports are globally accepted. We've got that enabled through the ICAO process, which sets the standards for the passports today. So it does provide that governance and interoperability between the member countries. And whilst with digital IDs, we face this really unique challenge of the digital nature, the complexity, and that need to balance security and privacy. So regarding your point on progress and what we need to be doing, you referenced, very clearly this point around the need for collaboration, and that actually we need collaborative efforts to really address the challenges around harmonization of standards and building the trust amongst stakeholders. So whilst we've got that, with the physical passport in a digital context, we need to think about some of these key questions around the differences in technology process, the difference in security and data management globally. So definitely the passport question, the physical passport questions is a logical starting point. And we do see, regional blocks that have made mutual recognition agreements. And you pointed out very comprehensively on the landscape, kind of where we're at today with Uruguay, where we have the EID card and generally the Mercosur countries in South America. But we do know that we are still, as you pointed out, have progress to make. And it's really about building that confidence. So coming back to the who, the how, and the what.
Thank you very much, Louise. My next question is to Johnny. Johnny, standardization, interoperability, data governance, and multi-stakeholder engagement have been highlighted as key to advancing acceptance of digital ID across borders. What steps are you taking towards these, and what lessons can you share from the international partnerships or bilateral labor mobility agreements with other countries that Canada has worked on or is working on?
Thank you so much for the invitation to join this conversation today. And I agree, it was seeing the research and your presentation of it was a great way for us to begin and ground our conversation. In terms of standardization, interoperability, data governance, and multi-stakeholder engagement, certainly all of those are foundations. I think some of this work forward also kind of has a dependency on the particular jurisdiction's governance model for that particular country. And so, for example, within the Canadian ecosystem, our governance model is a collaborative of individual governments where we have jurisdictional governments as data authorities on particular sets of data, like birth certificates if you're born in Canada, and our federal government being the authoritative on a permanent resident card or your status document if you've not been born in Canada. So so in countries where there's a more singular government, some approaches may be more beneficial. In a country like Canada, the aspect of multi-stakeholder engagement is an absolute imperative, because these different governments within our country need to collaborate with each other on the way forward. So what we see in that space is standardization is certainly key. There is often they're determining the pathway between investment in national standardization that is more attuned to the particular jurisdiction versus international standardization is certainly one area and aspect to look at. So we do have some Canadian national approaches that are evolving. That said, there is much focus and investment in other types of bodies like the W3C, the IETF, and bodies that are developing more, I would say, more international industry standards. And then certainly the suite of ISO standards play an important role. In terms of the adoption and what we're seeing in the Canadian ecosystem, just like standardization, there are many different approaches in terms of adoption. And so while in the United States, there was the, I would say, kind of the Apple logo and the more mobile driver's license approach for some of the jurisdictions in the United States. We haven't seen adoption necessarily of that, but many of the driving authorities are looking into potentially adopting that model. Within other jurisdictions, there currently is a lot of focus on the W3C approach and verifiable credentials and open source approach and open source digital wallets. So we certainly believe that there's going to be, for some time, more than one technical standards that live in the same ecosystem, which means interoperability is extremely important, and understanding where and how those different technologies can work together and where and how the challenges may be. And perhaps, more importantly, what is the level of trust that is bound to each of those technology approaches. And so I think from the kind of the underlying perspective here around data governance is knowing for both the issuer of the credential and the acceptor of the credential to have confidence in how the data was managed, how that data got into that credential, and in particular how that data was verified. So in your presentation, you mentioned know your customer, and we do see know your customer in anti-money laundering as a very important foundation, because reasonably there is a quite international approach to how that piece is how that's fulfilled. So we see that as an important building block as well, particularly for the functionality of functional digital ID. While it's going to take us in Canada more time to bring the legal ID into a digital format. The other piece that I'll note, and this may vary within each jurisdiction, is in terms of the multi-stakeholder engagement, one of the areas that we've really been working on is the public perception. So we've seen a kind of a typical bell curve. We've done research year over year, and we see around 55% of people say they do feel positive effects of these type of digital ID related capabilities, with 23% being unsure and 22% being highly skeptical. So with that around 45%, that's a large number of participants in the ecosystem who may or may not choose to use these technologies because of their not being sure and because of a lack of trust. Certainly, I would say that what we do see is the travel use case. So what your slide listed on the KTVI, traveling across borders is certainly a use case of importance. And there are projects happening inside of Canada from a cross-border that are moving toward cross-border capabilities, which are around digital identification for being used to identify the traveler inside of Canada. And so the next step will be to look to how can we work with IATA and other organizations to move that trust of that credential across the border. So I'd say there's a lot of movement happening. More projects also happening in the functional ID category, where Canadian banks are seeking how they can consume European digital identity for students who come to study in Canada. So the international student use case for identities coming into Canada is certainly of very high relevance as well, in addition to Canadian issued or Canadian jurisdictional issued digital identity, whether legal or functional, being accepted across another border. So it's a complex landscape. And I would agree with you on your call to action. The more collaboration and information sharing, the better, under around use cases that impact people the most.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for this extensive explanation. My next question goes to Samatar. I'll come, you mentioned, Jenny, about KYC. That will be a question to be asked to Kevin and Bridget later on, but I'll first ask Samatar. Samatar, digital infrastructure and access to basic identification credentials, such as birth certificate or national ID, have been raised as key for Africa before implementing digital ID. With over 60% of the migration from Africa happening within Africa, what can the African Development Bank do to improve the access of Africans to ID, including digital ID, and develop the much needed digital infrastructure that is harmonized across the region?
Thank you very much, Mamadou. I'm really very happy also to attend today to this important event. I would like to share a bit what we are doing at the African Development Bank, actually in digital development broadly. So what I would like to say is from the outset that the African Development Bank, actually, we are a bank that helps actually our regional member countries, which are the 54 African countries, in developing actually in implementing their national digital strategy. And generally in our project, actually we cover the three fundamental dimensions of digital development and inclusion, which are first of all, digital infrastructure. So what we do is we fund digital infrastructure project, and mainly it's about fiber optic links between different countries in order to make sure that when you are in a country A, you don't need to go all around the continent through satellite or submarine cable to communicate with the neighboring country. So the basic here is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, the PIDA, which recommend that each African country has to have a direct terrestrial link with its different neighboring country. So that's why, for example, in the African Development Bank, we are really very happy to support two major projects, actually, which are the Central Africa Backbone Project, and the Trans-Saharan Backbone projects. Actually, these two projects are the major infrastructure projects that have been funded by the bank since its creation. And for instance, in the Central Africa Backbone project, we have been able to interconnect Cameroon, Central Africa Republic, and Congo through fiber optic links. So, for example, in Central African Republic, the support from the bank and the European Union, which are with us in this project, was to actually set up the first national backbone in that country, and we're really very happy to have contributed to this major digital development actually in this region. And in addition, we have been able actually to recruit even a private operator that is helping the government through a PPP scheme to manage, commercialize, maintain, and even extend this this national fiber optic backbone. So we're doing really different, we're helping actually the countries based on their needs. So sometimes it's about digital infrastructure, and in other countries where these digital infrastructures are there, we are looking more on the e-government side. And per se, it's about digital usage. So it's about, actually it entails the implementation of national ID systems, government portals, trust administrative services, digital financial service. So we do different things. And for instance, we got the approval of a big e-government project recently. Actually, it was in July from our board of a total cost of 110 million euros for Côte d'Ivoire. And in that project, we were going to help the country to build its national data center, on which all the digital platform for the government are going to be built actually. So that's by way of illustration some of the project that we are working on. And specifically on digital ID, I would like also to mention the case of Chad, where we are now actually on the process of the recruitment of a private operator that will develop a digital ID, which is going to lay the foundation for having the three major pillars of the digital identity system for a country, which are actually a national population registry, a national civil registry, and as well as a biometric registry actually for the country. And all this is going to be developed through the Trans-Saharan Backbone project that we are also supporting in Chad. So we're doing different things, and I will be really very happy to interact with the attendees if they have any specific questions.
Thank you very much, Samatar, for this explanation. Let me now turn to Kevin. Kevin, Western Union is surely one of the oldest money transfer operators in the world. Could you please share how your approach to risk-based KYC and anti-money laundering has evolved over the years in the different geographies you operate in? And specifically, what are the challenges, the main challenges you do face with regards to KYC and anti-money laundering in the different geographies? Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou, and thanks for the great work from your team as well as Accenture on an important topic. Yes, Western Union is old. I think about 172 years old. I've been here about 17 months. So I think the history of Western Union goes back way before I even got here and way before some of us were even alive. So I'm not going to give you the full history of our risk-based practices over time. Particularly, I don't represent legal and compliance, so I want to make that caveat there. But having been in the industry of cross-border payments for 15 plus years and seeing a number of institutions struggle, I think there's three things to really break apart the issues. One is the channels, physical versus digital, right? Second is the form factor. How are you paying? Cash versus card versus bank account. And then lastly is the product breadth of the suite of services that a financial service company offers. So let's take channels. Western Union, as many of you probably know, started really as a cash-to-cash remittance player. So the 500,000+ locations we have around the world are so people could come in and bring us local currency. Identification in that context is actually quite, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it becomes a little bit easier when you have the person in front of you and you can match a physical individual with a physical ID picture. And, you know, obviously we're trained enough to understand what could constitute a potential falsified ID or a fake ID. But I would tell you, as we go into digital, obviously we don't necessarily have the same. That's why this topic is so important, right? And the things that we use vary country by country because countries are at different places of their financial digital ID journey. India is one, but think about places that we have to look at data points. We look at data points across, you know, the DMV records, IRS database, certain things to kind of form a picture of whether or not the person who is engaging with us on an app or on our website is who they say they are. But across all of those complications, that doesn't tell us enough because remember, we're doing financial transactions. Identification of an individual doesn't really tell you anything. We need to know your history, right? And obviously, so we do identify you because there are lists of sanctions and politically exposed people that we need to check. But at the end of the day, we want to know, Mamadou, if you've come in to a branch in Omaha and sent $500 and you've done that to 10 or 15 other Western Union branches in the course of a day, that something seems fishy, right? And so it's about the history of you as an individual. And by the way, the more channels you add, the more difficult it becomes just from a technical infrastructure perspective, because we can identify you as one individual over here and not realize that you're the same individual that's logged in with a different username and password over here until we really verified your identity. So having that history and having that unique identifier of you across these channels is going to be really important. Today, a lot of that lives within the walls of a single financial institution. But you could engage with Western Union, you can engage with Wise, you can engage with MoneyGram. What kind of information sharing do we have? Can the digital ID infrastructure help us understand that history, that financial picture? And this goes into your identification, classification of functional ID, which I think is really important to get the fact that remittances are very specifically focused on what is your financial and money movement history. So that's channels and the complications across channels and different companies. Form factor is where I used to accept $1 in cash today. I'm now accepting electronic dollars, which is, it's somewhat actually helpful for digital identification because the debit card you use, the ACH account that you link has identifying details about it. First name, last name. If that doesn't match the first name, last name you gave us, guess what? Something's wrong, right? So the form factor of payment actually helps quite a bit when it comes to electronic classification of identity. And then lastly, I talked about the suite of products. Listen, I think there are a lot of migrants who, quite frankly, are looking to send value home to their families that are in small values, and quite frankly, don't need and shouldn't go through the same hurdles as someone sending consistently thousands of dollars, right? So there are ways that we can measure risk based on the amount of payment, and of course, unless we understand like the history of you across other channels, we don't have that full picture, but we have a good enough picture to know whether or not you're high risk or not. So that last piece, around products and services is important because you're lower risk of sending a $200 payment than you are of opening an account with me and taking out a loan and doing all these other financial services, which Western Union has a strategy to enable our customers to further engage in financial services beyond just money transfers. So that's how I view the landscape. I think digital ID is important, but at the end of the day, we also need to know more than just that.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for for this detailed explanation, and also the refocusing of the discussion towards indeed the more transaction history based rather than the simple identification. Indeed, that is key. Let me now turn to Bridget Carroll. Bridget, and how do you approach risk-based, because Wise is a digital money transfer operator company. So, same question to Kevin. How do you approach risk-based KYC and AML requirements in different countries, especially considering access to digital platforms, by all migrants and specifically women, if you have any, disaggregation possible in your platforms? Thank you.
Hi, all, and thanks so much. And I will say we're a little bit younger than Western Union. So Wise has been around, 12 years. We're, a cross-border payments company building the best way to move money across borders. So our mission is instant, convenient, transparent, and eventually free cross-border payments. And so, today you can send to about 70 countries when sending money home. And we do try to take a risk-based approach as well. As you noted, we are digital only, so a little bit different in that sense. So digital ID will be paramount to us. So of course, we need to comply with all the KYC and AML rules across the jurisdictions that we operate in. Now, as much as those can be harmonized or converge is of course very useful to global MTOs, right? But if you're signing up for Wise, for example, the idea is that you're able to live an international life. So you're able to sign up once. Of course, if you move, you may have to supply more information to us, but we're really trying to build that account or product for people who are living global lives. So, for example, we tried to give additional information to serve refugees in the US, Canada, and EU, notably. So, a landing page on our website giving them information about the documents that they can use, including an alien passport or other sort of refugee documents to be verified with Wise. But I think on the digital side and trying to reach those different communities, including, people with disabilities, women, one of the things that we saw during the COVID-19 crisis was how powerful digital means can be in terms of meeting someone in their own home, allowing them, they might not be able to leave the house to go to a brick and mortar, but allowing them to still send that money, get verified. And so we're really trying to, like I said, take that risk-based approach. But yeah, I think it's digital ID would be, ideally around the world, standardized, interoperable. We've seen some countries, like you said, that have moved toward this, or in places like the EU with their EU digital ID wallet. But again, that will only be within Europe.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Indeed, you're right. I mean, this is what we identified throughout the research, that most of these innovations happen in regions within regions or countries that share same borders. Indeed. Thank you very much, Bridget. Let me get back to Kevin. Kevin, financial service providers, like such as Western Union, are already compliant with the requirements from individual jurisdictions, as you mentioned. Having said that, migrants may not have access to the proper identification, in the countries of destination. How can providers such as Western Union better serve migrants' financial needs? Should the digital ID of migrants from their countries of origin be accepted for cross-border remittances? Would that make any change or addition compared to your previous response?
Yeah, I mean, hugely. I mean, let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone who's moving to a new country, perhaps for the first time. And we serve a lot of folks who are doing it because they want to earn a better living, and their families back home want their children to go to great, better schools, be fed well. And they're coming to what is probably a different culture with a different language, with a different way of doing things. And just imagine the level of education. First of all, I have a financial service background. The level of education I have every day about how the heck some US systems work, right? Whether that's what the heck is a real ID? You know, so you learn these things clearly because I live here. But imagine someone coming to the first time. The education, and Bridget brought this up, just putting something on your website in terms of what forms of what is the process you go through? And if you had the identity that can span across borders, I think you've probably covered 50% of the heartache that one would go through, right? Because you've solved now, how do I apply for other things, social security number or a tax identifier? How do I then now make my first payment across border to my family back home? And so you solved a huge pain point around just onboarding yourself in a new land, in a new country that is foreign to you. That's number one. Number two, I would say, is the risk associated with that individual now, because you're crossing borders, but you have that history. I talked about, you know, the history of that individual being very important now. Now we have some sort of like something that ties that person not just to the country they're moving to, but the country where they've been. And in some ways, we can better identify risk or contextual type identifiers that would ultimately, I think, lower costs of doing business with any financial services business. So that has benefits for the customers. I think also access to capital. When you're coming to a new country, it's not just about sending money. I mean, I know we've been talking a lot about remittances, but imagine opening up all the other sort of financial services, the bank account, the checking account, if you're in the US, that is, debit, credit, whatnot. So having that history from a customer's perspective is really important, and to make that portable across borders would be hugely valuable.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this extensive response. Now let me turn to Samatar. Samatar, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is becoming a reality. In this context, how can digital ID be leveraged to speed up access to financial services for migrants among the countries who have ratified the Free Trade Agreement? And what role can the AFGB play in this?
Thank you, Mamadou. So I will try to illustrate again my response with some specific project on which we are working currently in different regions. But before going to that step, let me indicate that the African markets, generally, they are really too small to allow the development of a decent ecosystem for the advent of industrial production and integrated local, regional, and continental market. That's important actually to note. And the objective is, at the end of the day, to facilitate the intra-African trade, which is really very, very minor when we compare to other economical actually regions like the Europe, like other continents, let's say, like Europe or other places across the world. So that's why at the African Development Bank, we try actually to work at different levels. So the first level is the national one, and we support actually our member state to put in place the required digital foundation. And the digital ID is one of these foundations, and it's one of the three major ones actually. Digital identity. We need also to have certification and cybersecurity platform, and we need also to have financial services to make sure that transactions can be done online. So this is the first level at national level. Second, we're also working with the different regional economic communities to put in place the harmonized frameworks in different aspects that are related to regulation, policies, strategies, to ensure that these different countries can integrate actually their national identification system, financial systems, in order to actually to concretize or to actually help the continent to actually have a continental single digital market. So for example, we are working with IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is a regional economic communities for the Horn of Africa region, in a project that is called Horn of Africa Digital Market Integration. So the total cost of the first phase of this project is around 9 million, and we are actually helping them to accelerate the regional integration agenda through the filling of the main gaps that are hampering the establishment of a single African digital market across this specific region. So per se, we're going to address the issues related to lack of national digital financial services, digital payment system interoperability at national and regional level, logistics and addressing challenges, digital training offer, which is really also another major obstacle to integrate our economies. So having said that, the digital ID piece is a really fundamental one. So we have different countries that are already working on the setup of a national ID system. And it's a long journey, and we need actually to help them if they have secured the investment actually fund to set up the system. There is always need to provide some technical assistance in order to help them to, for example, set up an independent instance for data protection, for example, or even help them to review the laws related to data protection and so on and so forth. So I would like just to say that the type of support that we provide to our countries are different, actually, based on what are the real needs. And digital identity is a must, but we see also in some countries that before going to that level, there are some pressing issues that have to be actually addressed, and the major one is really the digital infrastructure. And again, without digital infrastructure, what can you do? So we actually adapt our support and assistance to our countries based on where they are in the journey in the digitalization of their economy.
Thank you very much, Samata, for this extensive response. Now I'd like to go to Bridget. Bridget, since you mentioned that you're representing a very new digital money transfer operator, and also you mentioned that actually you leverage technology strongly. How do you see digital money transfer operators leading the discussions towards the cross-border portability of digital identities?
I mean, I think we should be at the forefront, right? But just to speak from the WISE perspective, currently, I don't believe we're accepting any like current digital ID or sort of EID. That doesn't mean we're not really interested in it. It's a matter of integrating and implementing across many different jurisdictions. And you can imagine, as a global company, that is a step-by-step process. But the issue with those is also like the lack of standardization, but also accessibility. So just to give one example, there has been a very successful digital ID, bank ID in Sweden, for example. That was created by sort of private institutions. It became a quasi-public good. It's accepted. I think they're 98% of working age people who are using it, which is an incredible number in terms of uptake. So many citizens are using this. However, the Swedish banks created this system, which is wonderful, but you cannot access it without a Swedish incorporation number. So for example, a non-bank that's not incorporated in Sweden cannot use that bank ID. So it's just an example of how there are limits to the access to these type of systems, especially for non-banks or remittance providers. And so undoing, I think, these type of blockers will help unlock digital ID across more jurisdictions Of course, I would be amiss to not mention other dimensions of this, like de-risking of MTOs, which is something that we see across the industry. But today, most financial service providers like us are sort of using third-party verification providers, for example, which offer different ways of verifying your customer based on no physical documents. And so this goes back to today, we're in a day and age where we're basically just doing a digital verification of physical documents. So how do we move into the digital identity itself then being verified digitally, right? So I think for us, the main issue is, like I said, the interoperability that also has to align with a convergence of AML KYC rules, which even within Europe, there is still fragmentation across different member states, but then also portability. So in an ideal world, like we said, today, each of our financial institutions are verifying someone, and then that is redone again and again, which is not a very efficient process just in itself. So there could be cost savings there. There could be increased information sharing, and that will benefit not only the financial institutions, but also remittance senders who need to be able to access our services.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Let me turn to Johnny. So Johnny, in North America, there is a free trade area named NAFTA between Mexico, the US, and Canada. However, when we look at digital ID initiative, contrary to what we see in other regions, there doesn't seem to be convergence in setup standards or timelines. What may be the root cause of this, and what can be done, according to you, across North America to create harmonization? Thank you.
Yes, I would say that even though the free trade agreement does exist and certainly applies to trade, when we get into the ecosystem of digital identity, some of the jurisdictional challenges and strengths of the US and Canada and Mexico come into play. And so I think one of the root challenges in the context of that particular region is that we don't yet have, and to build on the last intervention, we don't really have digital identities that are usable. We may have some forms or some steps, but we don't have digital identities that are credentials that are in digital wallets or able to be issued into digital wallets or consumed into digital wallets. And so that foundation of that identification, that government issued identification, legal identification, we don't have it ubiquitously across Canada. And similarly, it's not available ubiquitously across the US. Certainly there are particular states or particular provinces within within US or within Canada that have taken more steps forward. But having that legal identity today, we're largely doing exactly what was just shared. We're largely services are taking selfie photos, matching to identity documents that are photos of identity documents, and doing verification and validation in that way. So we are, I would say, reasonably in that bridge state where we're using physical and paper and plastic documents, taking pictures and validating and verifying matches of biometric matches or matches into databases, and that's how that's as far as we've gotten, I would say, at that way forward. Similar challenges within Mexico and the Mexican states. So we do in Canada, one of our provinces is about to, I believe in the beginning of calendar quarter 1 or 2, they do plan to make available to all of the provincial residents a verifiable credential. So there would be a QR code verifiable credential that can load in particular pieces of data into a digital wallet. So we're starting to see pieces of that come forward. But again, it's going to be jurisdictional, and its acceptance will depend on the other party also having particular technology. They're complex regions, each with slightly different governances. The challenge with Canada, having 13 governments collaborating and working together, you have at least 13 opportunities to issue a digital identity credential from a legal authority. Within the US, of course, 50 states, even more challenging. And even within each of those regions, there are some provinces or some states that have more resources and some that have less. And so their transformation journey is not happening at the same speed or the same pace either. So yes, I would say kind of the challenges around those three countries being able to accept and share digital identification does have to do with size, governance, resource distribution, as well as a number of technologies that are still competing for which technology will be one of the dominant or more dominant adoption will be the most moderately adopted out into the ecosystem. So certainly we have positives to build on, again, within the financial ecosystems and the some of the foundations that were talked about in the bank ID approach in Sweden. Canada is using some elements of that bank ID approach within our ecosystem, but not fully deployed, again, in pockets of partners who want to share information. So we've got a way to go in working together to be collaborative. I think interoperability and acceptance among those three regions and internal to those three regions will come in pockets, will come in small cohorts of progress, of an innovation, as well as in alignments of policies. And we will start to see those smaller cohorts of interoperability, or those functional ID and industry-based financial ID pockets start to grow. And we will see that happen, but it's going to take a lot of time.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Let me now ask maybe the last question from my side, and we go to the questions from the audience. My last question will go to Louise. Louise, what approach, after all what we've heard and discussed, what approach should stakeholders follow to work on this standardization? Because this is now the key, alignment standardization. Are there any existing global or regional institutions that can be leveraged? For instance, we've seen the OECD, recommendations. We've seen the International Air Transport Association, One ID initiative. So what sort of governance structure should be in place to better serve people on the move and digital ID across the borders? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mamadou. And I'll try and keep my answer brief, because I know we've got lots of great questions that have come in. Obviously, standardization is so key, but we know that it is super complex. It requires this collaboration. And it's so important that we have governments and regulators working together to really sort of endorse this usage of digital identity solutions, to really give financial service providers that confidence to adopt it. So as you mentioned, there are many things out there already in terms of the ISO, the IEC, the OECD, too many acronyms, the IATA's One ID, and these are all examples, right, where we're starting to see we have some standards there, and they are all very valuable resources for creating those internationally recognized standards. In terms of your question about new institutions, I think people always sort of have a bit of a sigh if we say, is there going to be another new institution? So I think our perspective is perhaps we don't need an entirely new organization, but how can we work with existing institutions to really adapt and expand the existing efforts to address the digital identity challenges? So within those institutions, we should focus more on specialized task forces, working groups, consortiums that can really focus on this standardization questions, and bringing these entities together to work on very specific aspects around emerging technologies and threats, how they're remaining up to date and responsive. And of course, you know, the role of financial services is incredibly important, and for FS providers to work directly with government regulators on the issues that we've talked about, and engaging through global organizations such as the Financial Task Action Force. So in summary, because I know we want to get to the questions that have come in, you know, standardization really does require this collective effort, probably not setting up a new structure, but how can we work within the existing ones and just create that specialist focus on it. Thanks, Mamadou, back to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much for all the panel members for these first rounds of discussions. We've received a couple of questions from, you know, like many questions, not a couple of questions from the audience. We'll try to respond to some of them now within the time, and then to all the other questions we've not been successful in responding, we'll be putting them into writing and respond to the participants. I'd like to start with the first question, you know, up to Louise, Samatar, Johnny. You may want to take it. It's related to digital identification and biometrics. You know, so when talking about migrants, digital identity, you know, risk of frauds and financial services, you know, some participants are wondering whether to solve all of these challenges related to authentication, etc., we shouldn't just be relying on biometrics, you know, fingerprints, iris, where that would, you know, by just using that, we just eliminate the frauds that is within there, or whether it is a bit more complex than that.
Well, maybe I can kick off, Mamadou, very briefly to say, you know, biometrics clearly does have, you know, a great role to play, but, you know, you mentioned fraud, and I think we should recognize that, you know, biometrics are it's very sensitive data, and there is still fraud, right, and an ability to hack biometric data. So, you know, yes, there is a clear role for biometric data, but we have to take into account how the data is captured and tracked, you know, what data should be captured, and think about, you know, personal data and security. It requires significant investment in order to make sure that we have the biometric systems. So, you know, yes, there is a role, but we have to be acutely aware of the challenges around the privacy concern and sensitivity around that. So that would be my view, but I'll turn to others.
Yeah, I think I could add in there as well. Very much in agreement with Louise in the sense of using biometric where it's required. Each jurisdiction has its own process, and we have to depend on the regional jurisdiction for its process. So for us in Canada, our Immigration and Refugees Federal Department has their processes for how they do their identity verification to the layer for a person arriving without any identity documents. For a person immigrating with identity documents, there is a biometric. So all of us do have some form of biometrics within our legal identification file, whether that's for us within a federal government or within a provincial government, a more local government. Where and how those biometrics are then used out in the ecosystem is much more up to debate, and it will likely be one of the methodologies. We're starting domestically now, something that Europe has had in place for quite a long while, and the biometric recognition for the passport control as one of the options. And we're starting, and some pilots are starting in Canadian domestic airports for travelers who would like to use a biometric to board a plane, who have provided their identity document and is matching to that identity document, and they'd like to use a biometric to board a plane. So again, I think it's going to be used in particular use cases and would be thought of as one of a suite of technologies and capabilities, but of course must be guided by and implemented with ideally strong privacy protection, data protection, and control of where and how that biometric is used and where and how it's stored.
Yes, can I come in?
Sure.
Yes, thanks, Ramadan. Thanks to the other panelists. Actually, what I would like to say is actually one of the major issues that we have in identification, digital ID, is the inclusivity part. And it's really very important to make sure that the technology which is used make sure that no one is actually put aside from the digital ID system. And so in some cases, the reason why we don't have actually choice is the fact that in some cases you have really a high rate of illiteracy, and you need to have some technologies that actually help everyone to be actually part of the digitalization journey of the target of the concerned country. So biometric, in some cases, it's a must because you don't have any other option. You cannot use chips card, for example, because of the rate of illiteracy. So you need to deal with the risk related to the biometric technology, knowing that it's the only way maybe to get the actually involvement of the whole population if you have a high rate of illiteracy.
Thank you very much, Samatar. Now there is a question. The next question is for the remittance service providers, Western Union and WISE, related to how the digital identity across borders can help solve the issue of anti-money laundering, and whether new technologies such as machine learning, can help fine-tune or reduce drastically the fraud and improve the formal remittance flows. And also next to that, Kevin, you mentioned earlier that actually your view is to enable the people and migrants to access a broader suite of financial services beyond the payments. So there was also another question, additional question about access to credit. What would be needed on top of the portability of ID and the AML and safety and KYC in order for migrants or refugees to get access to credit? Kevin, maybe you first, and then Bridget can add. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in those three questions. It's hard to understand where to start. I'll maybe the understanding KYC and AML with cross-border ID would help us. I think in some ways, let me just talk practically about some of the complications of having no defined standards around ID. When someone sends money from the US to a relative in Thailand, for example, the relative in Thailand may not necessarily have a name that is Roman letters. I mean, it may be spelled in multiple different ways. We may not really understand how Thai can translate easily into the Roman alphabet and vice versa. And so we end up making essentially judgment calls, risk assessment. Sometimes we get it wrong and it's a legitimate payment. And however, we need to do a little bit more due diligence and talk to the customer in some cases. So just easing the complexity, and people are sending money here for purposes of their daily sustenance. So it's important to not hold up a payment for what could be even hours or days. And so we want to make it very frictionless for someone to send money, right? But at the same time, we want to make sure it's highly compliant. So standardization is really helpful. And we have, you mentioned machine learning. We have machine learning tools that help us do name matching to know that William is Bill and Bill is William, and whatever other countries have that same issue around just the name itself, let alone addresses and other pieces of information, whether or not a digit is missing from a bank account by accident. And so imagine the amount of data that gets lost in translation. And so if we could standardize that, I think we'd solve a lot of the pain points that we see in the friction of cross-border payments. Machine learning is great to be able to work in a non-standardized environment and then make risk calls. But I also talked earlier about moving from physical to digital and some of the challenge in digital. The great thing about digital, it gives us more data points. And so we can recognize a customer the second time around as being the same customer by how they approach their app and how they type on the keyboard of a smartphone. I mean, that's incredible, because think about account takeover. We know their patterns. All of a sudden, one day, something seems off. It could be that someone has literally taken over their phone and they're taking over their account, and we have stopped that. So with digital comes huge benefits, and machine learning combined with that will help us provide a better experience, reduce risk for the customer, which means reducing fraud and being more compliant in how we approach KYC and AML.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Brigitte, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to speak to the machine learning element. I think across, MTOs, fintechs, and banks, what you'll see is generally, it's being used for AML, but also fraud detection. So just to give like a really tangible example, with machine learning, you're able to analyze millions of documents and check details against blacklists instantly before that onboarding process even begins. As well, you can use it to identify suspicious activities, flag potential trends or cases. And the key part, I think, to that is that it allows MTOs and financial service providers to then focus resources on high-risk customers. It's kind of enabling that risk-based approach, right? But in tandem with that, what's essential is that our regulator also feels comfortable with and enables a risk-based approach. And I think that often what we see on paper is not always the case in practice when it comes to allowing a risk-based approach. So we want to make sure that we are finding a balance between ensuring that no one's abusing our platform, but at the same time allowing barriers reducing barriers to entry for refugees, migrants, people sending remittances, et cetera. So there is a balance there. I do think using technology can support that process, enable it. Any financial company today should be using technology to do these types of checks. And this will only evolve. It's important that we stay ahead of the curve, I think, on these things, and also use technology to allow for accessibility and not sort of prevent it.
Thank you very much. We've nearly reached the end of the time, so maybe one last question to maybe to Johnny. Hope you're still around. Yeah. There is a question, but I think we've already addressed it about how can a given jurisdiction ensure that actually an identity that it accepts is also accepted by other jurisdictions. Practically speaking, there's a participant who's asking how practically can that be achieved? Is it through just standardization, or is it like through a higher body? Practically from your experience, how can that be achieved?
Yeah, I would say in a number of ways. In the context of accepting an identity from one jurisdiction into another, the important pieces again are that for an identity that's issued, for a credential that's issued, that we have a common understanding or common ground on the identity validation and verification. So we know that the information that's gotten into that's been issued into that credential has been verified to a degree that is reasonable and accepted within an ecosystem, within a community. So when we think about the standardization piece, having standardized identity proofing, identity validation, and knowing you can have that layer of trust in the information that's being presented. The secondary piece of that would be if it is in a digital identity context, building on common technical standards, and there may be more than one technical standard that's required, whether that's again from a credentials perspective. I would say the two models that we're seeing the most exploration, innovation, and adoption around are around the W3C verifiable credentials and the ISO mobile driver's license credentials. So there will also need to be the ability to accept one or more or implement one or more technological methods along the way. So I think seeing that in a more practical way, we can take and do see patterns around particular identity cards that are widely accepted and broadly accepted everywhere. For example, driver's license, which is why this is such a powerful credential. And so the ability to represent already commonly agreed upon identity proofing and validation processes, let's say within a jurisdiction like inside of Canada, being able to move those into digital equivalents that are tamper-proof and strong and privacy respecting. So building onto ecosystems that we have, and not only the photo capture of that credential, but actually the digital first issuance of that credential into tools like digital wallets or networks. So I think it's a mix of those solutions together.
Thank you very much, Johnny. I think we've reached the end of the allocated time. I would like to thank you very much for having accepted the invitation to join this webinar. Thank you to Louise, Bridget, Samatar, Kevin, and Johnny for having joined us. Thanks to all the participants who have spent the past 1 hour and a half. And we will continue to work. We'll have other events. We will peer review, finalize the report, and publish it. And then we'll continue the discussion around the topic. Thank you all very much, and see you soon.
Thank you, Mama.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good day.